Good afternoon, colleagues, peers, guests. Welcome after our summer break. I'm absolutely delighted that we're going to be running a seminar series of digital events on behalf of the Prison and Probation Research Hub, focusing particularly on probation. And as you may well have seen, we've got a really exciting lineup and there'll be more to follow. So do keep an eye out for those. The greatest pleasure of introducing Professor Rob Canton. I've known him many years as a dear colleague, friend, mentor, and he agreed after I approached him to talk about probation as social work. And as ever, I find Rob's presentations, conversations, thought-provoking, provocative, and stimulating, and I'll hope you will agree with that. Rob has served as a probation officer for 20 years, and he told me today that he's also done 20 years as an academic. So we can perhaps reflect on that he is both a scholar and a practitioner, although he may disagree with that point. And I think one thing of note is well published, comments lots on punishment and probation, and is supportive to colleagues, students, etc. He was presented with an honorary life member for the CEP in recognition for his work on probation. So please do put your comments or questions. There'll be time at the end when Rob's finished his presentation to take questions from the audience. So please make that interactive and I'll field the questions on behalf of you all today. Rob, are you there?
I certainly am, Vic. Is it time for me to begin?
It's time for you to begin.
All right.
Thank you, Rob.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Vic, for that very generous introduction. As Vic says, I've been involved in probation for a long time, and the title I've set for myself for today's talk is Probation as Social Work. And on the slide, you'll be able to see that I've proudly boasted that I hold a CQSW, which stands for the Certificate of Qualification in Social Work. And thanks, I should have said earlier, thanks to you all for tuning in. And as Vic says, I'm looking forward to some questions and comments and some challenges here. What I want to talk about is why probation turned its back on social work many years ago, and I'll put the historical background in a bit. Why was the government so keen to dismiss the association with social work? And why was it that so many people in the probation service felt it important to resist that and to challenge it? What are the advantages of understanding probation as social work? How have changing views about the association between probation and social work been reflected, and how have they reinforced different conceptions of the work of probation? And at various times, I'll be making links with probation education and training, which, as many of you will know, is something that De Montfort has long been heavily involved in. So for many people, for most of the 20th century, it was simply taken for granted that probation is social work. It's social work in a criminal justice setting. And in the late 1960s, there was a Lord Seabohm reported and suggested a merger of the many different branches of social work. So back in those days, you might have had, for example, a social worker who was responsible for mental health, and a childcare social worker, and an adult social care worker. And they were all separate. They had their own lines and areas of expertise. And you might even have had people from those different departments visiting the same household on consecutive days, or even maybe, for all I know, bumping into one another on the doorstep. And the Seabohm report said that's no good. We need to have instead generic social workers. And there was a question at the time about whether probation should be involved in that. And although probation was beyond Seabohm's remit, nevertheless, it was part of the awareness, part of the conversation. And in many countries, it's simply taken for granted that probation is social work. After all, its skills are shared, the skills of casework, about which I'll be saying more later, and its values are shared as well, and that will be something I'll be talking about a lot. And a common education. So in the parliamentary debates that took place after the Seabohm report was published, it was remarked, "I'm glad to see they're now coming under the same local authority department, and I hope the probation service will come in due course." So then out of the blue in 1990s, it was announced very emphatically that probation isn't social work. In the 1990s, Michael Howard, the Home Secretary of the day, rejected social work as the way to understand probation. It then followed that probation social work qualification was no longer required to practice. As I've said when I introduced myself, I hold a certificate of qualification in social work, and that at the time that I qualified was what you needed in order to do the work. But Michael Howard rejected all of this, and perhaps the most important reason was that social work was recognized as a caring profession, and that was very much at odds with the conception of probation as being punishment but taking place in the community. That didn't fit at all well together, and again, that's something that people might want to reflect on and about which I'll make further comment as we go along. This meant that when in 1997, on the election of the new Labour government, invitations were made for people to bid to teach and to deliver the new probation qualification, but it was made abundantly clear that social work programs were not eligible to bid. If you wanted to deliver this new training, don't be a social work department. And not everyone listening perhaps will know that this was the origins of the division of community and criminal justice at De Montfort. Up until that time, there had just been a social work division, but De Montfort was keen to continue to be involved in probation training, so it had to build a new structure to deliver that. And it was inspired and led by terribly important contributions from Professor Dave Ward and Charlotte Knight, both without whose involvement I don't think we would have the successful division that we now have. What was all this about? Well, David Garland, whose influential book, The Culture of Control, came out in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, spoke about a change in the emotional temperature of penal policy making. So there had been a time when offenders, people who committed criminal offences, were presented as disadvantaged and deserving and subject of need, all of which, of course, fits very happily and comfortably with conceptions of social work, but this was replaced by a stereotypical depiction of unruly youth, dangerous predators, incorrigible career criminals, for which social work, with its associations of caring, clearly on the face of it, seemed altogether less appropriate. Some of David Garland's points can be found in parliamentary testimony of the time. So the Home Affairs Select Committee in 1998 said that they deplored the use of the term client to describe criminals who are serving sentences. And the word deplore is worth reflecting on, isn't it? It's quite a strong word. They don't say that it's inaccurate or they think better words might be used. They deplore it. And in a moment, we'll try to see if we can make sense of why people were so vehement about this. And at the same time, they decided that this was a time to introduce new terminology to describe the work that probation did. We all had to talk about criminals and offenders. Community service was no good. Probation itself was no good. And we were going to have community orders and community supervision and all sorts of different, tougher terminology. 2007 marked the centenary of the Probation of Offenders Act, which was passed in 1907. And at Westminster Abbey, at a service to mark that centenary, the Bishop of Worcester interestingly reflected how clients have become offenders, it seems. And offender slides easily from being a statement of fact that someone's committed an offence or some offences into an assertion of identity. They, like the publicans and sinners of the gospel reading, become a social class, a them. So there was resistance to this push, but nevertheless, the following year we found Jack Straw, who had now become the country's first ever Minister of Justice, huffing quite proudly that he had succeeded in persuading the probation service to talk about the people under their supervision as offenders, which is what they are, and not what he describes as the euphemistic nonsense of clients when the client is the victim and the tax-paying public. And I think there are a number of clues here about why it is that probation was no longer to be considered social work, and why that push came from, even from a new Labour government from which we had hoped better. This is all the stranger. Probation was rejected at just the time when policy and practice were increasingly aligning them. Both were involved in case management, in multi-agency work, recognizing the importance of anti-oppressive practice, acknowledging the priority of risk assessment and risk management. Both agencies, after all, work with people in distress, in poverty and deprivation, lives often scarred by trauma. And indeed, commonly, clients are involuntary. This is an expression that one particularly associates perhaps with probation. An important text in probation by Chris Trotter is a book called Working with Involuntary Clients. Now, the term involuntary client, it doesn't mean that people don't want to do this or that they always resent these interventions. And it certainly doesn't mean that they don't benefit, but it does mean that they are clients whether they want to be or not. And it seems to me abundantly clear that this applies both to the clients of probation and to the clients of social work. And both professions work in confusing and uncertain contexts where solutions aren't easy to specify, let alone to achieve. Let's take a step back a minute. This slide offers one way of understanding best practice, perhaps in all professions. So best practice occurs when staff who are endowed with the knowledge and understanding that they need to do their work deploy their skills in ways that give expression to the profession's values. And I think this characterization probably could apply to all professions. Certainly it applies to both probation and to social work. And if we disentangle in this way and visit the question, is probation social work? From that point of view, what do we get? Well, the knowledge overlaps. For example, both might be interested in human psychology and development and in sociological insights. So the knowledge overlaps, but it's not quite coextensive. You do need to know certain things about the law to practice probation, which are not quite the same that you would need to know for practicing social work. So there is a degree of specialization here. When it comes to skills, there are even more similarities. Both professions are keen on the importance of human relationships, of effective communication with staff who are able to solve problems, to analyze, to judge, to work effectively side by side with other people. And this goes just as much for social work as for probation. Now, because this is to me pretty self-evident and even uncontroversial, one assumes that the vehemence with which Jack Straw and the House of Commons Select Committee attacked the characterization of probation as social work probably rested on the idea of its professional values. Now on the screen, this is real ancient history, but to anyone of my generation, and perhaps for some years after, the text of the casework relationship by Father Felix Bistek, a Roman Catholic priest from the United States of America, set out the ethics of social work, the guiding principles. And I won't read all of those out to you on the screen, but these were, for him, the things that marked the values of social work, that social work should try to express and realize in its practice. So if we have these principles, or here are some of them, not the whole list down the left-hand side, what now does probation stand for? Well, Probation also insists, it doesn't talk so much these days about casework, but it certainly talks about the value of a professional relationship and the therapeutic alliance. If social work talks about individualization, probation insists on responsivity, the way in which people are in many respects different from one another, and that diversity must be respected, and ways must be found of working with people that acknowledge and take advantage of and make sure that those differences are respected. Emotional literacy, which is a concept that Charlotte Knight has written about so eloquently, is another important factor here, and perhaps is the same as controlled emotional involvement. Recognizing one's own emotions in the work, because this is emotive work, both probation and social work, recognizing the emotions that the client is experiencing, and so on. And the desistance paradigm has also generated some other important principles here. The importance of co-production, of valuing strengths, of negotiation and dialogue. So many of the principles of social work, despite its formal rejection, have re-emerged, even though they are now articulated in a different terminology. Well, that's all very well, but what about being non-judgmental? What about client self-determination? And what about confidentiality? These seem odd principles to apply when you're talking about working with people who've committed crimes, and some of whom present a significant risk and may be resolved on committing more crimes, or might find themselves lapsing into that. Now, I'd want to say that this is difficult, but it's just as difficult for social work as it is for probation, and for the same reasons. I do incidentally have a problem with sets of principles like this, but that might be a topic for another time. My problem is that they're seldom of real help in the toughest cases. So we can agree that confidentiality means that you shouldn't go away and gossip with the neighbours. But we should also probably nowadays, most people I think acknowledge that confidentiality can't be total. Authorities must be informed when vulnerable people are at risk. So just at the point that it gets hard, because there will be some hard cases to know what the boundaries are, these broad principles don't help us all that much. But the point I want to insist on at the moment is that this is just as difficult for social work as it is for probation. What about self-determination and agency? And I remember, although I can't give you a quotation, that this was particularly troubled people. But the principle never meant, that self-determination never meant that probation staff were indifferent to how people behave, just as it is that social workers do all they can to safeguard vulnerable people. What it is, I think, best understood as an ethical principle, people should be in charge of their own lives, and a pragmatic one, people will act as they decide to. And much of this aligns with desistance. And Sue Rex puts it well, offenders need to be addressed as active participants rather than passive recipients of punishment or treatment, and they must be positively motivated to engage in processes of change. So in practice, the values that probation now espouse, pro-social modelling and motivational work and respect for persons, all of these things I've been talking about, offender engagement, these are better understood not as the application of abstract principles imposed upon practice, but emerging from good folk trying to do the right thing in complex states of affairs. And the reason why the values of probation persist, the values of social work persist, is because this is what it takes to do the job. So the government can say, oh, no, we're not going to treat people with respect. We're going to remind them that they're offenders. We're not going to accord them the sense of service and entitlement that is suggested by the word client. But probation has to do this because you cannot otherwise do the job at all, let alone do it well. People did begin to fight back about social work, and Peter Rayner reminded us that there are many good examples of social work which can be applied in probation practice. And as he puts it at the end of this quotation, the search for effective practice can't afford to ignore relevant research just because it goes under a currently disparaged label. And David Smith insists that for all the rhetoric of punishment and public protection, risk management, and so on, when practitioners decide what they're actually going to do to engage and motivate clients, to help them to access resources, convey a sense of hope in the possibility of constructive change, they'll find themselves using ideas and skills that have emerged from social work theory and research. An early beginning to a formal recognition that many of the deprivations and disadvantages that beset people in probation are behind their offending, but also interfere with their desistance, was a report from the Reducing Reoffending by Ex-Prisoners report from the Social Exclusion Unit, which came from the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, and was not long after followed by an action plan from the Home Office, remembering that the Ministry of Justice didn't exist then, on reducing reoffending. And what this uncovered was the enormous deprivations that beset so many people within the penal system. Unfortunately, I think it was unfortunate, the identification of these factors was soon transformed into a set of criminogenic needs. So the Social Exclusion Unit, having noted how deprived people are, they then say, well, this is all about offending. Think of the enormous costs that are involved in this, rather than saying that the penal system has exposed a really needy group of folk who need attention because that is their decent entitlement and that is their human right, irrespective of the contingent effects on offending. And that sometimes indeed it's the action plan talks about interagency work, but sometimes rather than probation trying to recruit every agency to its priorities and causes, it may be better to see probation as contributing to the duty of all agencies to meet the needs of some of their most vulnerable clients. You'll be familiar with charts of this kind. This is from the Prison Reform Trust report that was published, in fact, only about a few months ago, I think. And I'm not going to go through this in all detail, but many of you will be utterly familiar with this, that whether we're talking about abuse and trauma in childhood, educational achievements, exclusions, qualifications, employment, housing, psychosis, anxiety, depression, drug use, all of these things are massively overrepresented in the prison population, and pretty well everyone in the prison population has at one time or another also been on a probation population. So the probation caseload is very, very similar in these respects. And many of these factors are clearly profound social needs. Now, desistance scholarship has encouraged us to made it less fashionable to talk about needs. We shouldn't just talk about people in terms of their deficits, so to speak. Instead, we should recognize and cultivate their strengths. And certainly I agree that building on people's strengths is often the way out of crime. A preoccupation with their shortcomings and their bad decisions is often not the most helpful way to proceed. But there are needs here that can't be just wished away. Some people need assistance with problems of drug misuse. Many are mentally vulnerable. A huge number of people experience discrimination in the employment market, and it's hard to prosper when you have nowhere to live. So it's all very well to say that strengths are to be built on, but these are needs that would overwhelm most of us. I should add to this the increased awareness in recent years of trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Study after study has exposed the importance of trauma-informed practice. But as usual, politicians and the less responsible sectors of the of the media denounce people who commit crimes, and they lament the happiness occasioned to victims, without at any point recognizing that in so many cases these are the same people. Jamie Bennett put this well, I think, when he spoke about the way in which, if we start saying that homelessness and unemployment and poverty and perhaps domestic abuse, that these are risk factors, we're institutionalizing in a structured assessment the social injustices that lie behind those disadvantages and entrenching social exclusion within the criminal justice system. Could we maybe reverse some of this process? Instead of identifying needs and redefining them as risks, perhaps we could do it the other way around and say that risk factors should be regarded as needs to be met as a matter of social justice, irrespective of their relationship with offending. And as I think I've already said, partnership perhaps should be seen not as recruiting everyone to probation's work, but as probation facilitating the access of other agencies to some of their most vulnerable clients. And perhaps that oblique approach will in the end turn out to be more effective in bringing about crime reduction than hectoring, scolding, and overzealous enforcement. The word offender is disdainful and it's reductive. And as David Smith, who puts these things so well, points out, if you talk about offending behaviour, as probation so often has to be doing, it implies that it's the offenders, the criminals, the people with convictions that must change and not their social circumstances. And it abstracts the offending act itself from the personal and relational context, which makes it intelligible. Another way of putting this is I owe these thoughts to a French scholar called he practices in America now, but Didier Fassin, who talks about the importance of recognizing social production. A lot of crime emerges from a context in which people's options are so constrained that they find themselves impelled into crime, but also social construction. We know that processes of criminalization and enforcement are unevenly applied. And to talk about offenders in this reductive tone loses all that context, that social production and that social construction, without which we can't really begin to make any sense, let alone respond intelligently and decently to problems of crime. Some of this will be familiar to you from the work of the American scholar Jonathan Simon, who wrote an extremely influential book called Governing Through Crime. And he points out that as the decline of the welfare state and the growth of the penal state take place at the same time. And he argues that when the United States of America, and they've certainly been imitated by many European countries, including this one, as they found themselves unable to deal with the miseries caused by neoliberalism, they reframed many problems as crimes, or at least as conduct that called for crime-like responses. Because that's something they can, or at least can be seen to, deal with. Crime is easier to deal with. You can't solve poverty, but you can punish people and make it difficult and make access to welfare benefits difficult. You can't give everyone accommodation, but you can give the homeless a great deal of grief. You can act in a strong-handed and firm-handed way and make sure that people are put under considerable pressure to accept solutions that are preferred. Could we roll this back? If social problems can be conceptualized in this way, could we reframe crimes as social problems? Now, most obviously, perhaps, we might think here of drug misuse. Treating drug misuse as a crime creates criminals, it creates misery, it creates a drugs market, it creates overcrowded prison populations. What's the point of doing that? And crimes associated with trauma and mental distress, why would we want to see the manifestations of those pains? Why would we want to regard them as crimes and deal with them in a criminal justice system that is so poorly equipped to meet their needs. So once upon a time, people said, well, we have a concept of criminogenic need, crime-causing needs. These are just dynamic risk factors. And my challenge here is to suggest that maybe we could reverse that. We could look at some of these dynamic risk factors, see whether they are needs and whether they are social arrangements that might be able to meet some of those needs. What you may be wondering is that is a plug for my new book, which is coming out, I hope, next year, and which will try to develop some of those ideas about how we might roll back governing through crime. So let's return to our question about whether probation is social work. Well, here's a definition of social work that's on the slide. It promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of people. It stands for social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, respect for diversities. So what in that definition should any probation agency or manager or policymaker object to? In what sense is probation not committed to just that cause or causes? So if I've established, or at least I've tried to establish, that probation could be understood as social work in a criminal justice setting, why should it? Well, here are, I think, three particular reasons why. First of all, its context. Probation, regarding it as social work, recognizes that that crimes take place in a context, that no one is reducible to the idea of simply being an offender. Secondly, it's about care. Now, I haven't time to develop this particular thought, but in other settings, and I've written about this a bit with my friend Jane Dominy, we argue that care against control is a very poor way of framing probation's mission. Should it be care or should it be control? If you understand things in that way, then immediately care will collapse. But the opposite of care is not control. And indeed, caring about people does not mean that you're indifferent to their behavior. It means that you do accord them the consideration. You make sure that their interests, while their interests may not always be decisive, and certainly their preferences are not always decisive, their interests and their preferences always matter. And if you evince that in your practice, then I would say that that is a demonstration of care. That is also at the same time more effective than the mechanisms of control, enforcement, and so forth that we are familiar with. And then respect. What Jack Straw was really on about, I think, is that offenders are to be guarded against, they're to be punished, they're to be deplored, they're to be despised. But what probation staff wanted to insist on, and why I favour a word like client, is to repeat that clients are people who are entitled to a service. They're entitled to be consulted. They're entitled to dialogue and discussion. They're entitled to disagreement, and they're above all entitled to respect and dignity. So if I can just conclude in the last few minutes of my talk by talking a bit about some milestones in probation education. So in 1971, the CQSW was introduced, and at that time, the generic training available for social workers was made available to probation as well. By the mid-1980s, it was a requirement. People were no longer to be appointed as probation officers without that CQSW. In 1989, there was, I think, quite an important development, and indeed this one, I think, is an improvement, when people said, well, there are, as I noted earlier, differences in the knowledge requirements. And there was some concern that probation's knowledge, particularly about sentencing law, and penal practice, was insufficiently represented in the CQSW curriculum. So they needed a distinctive curriculum of their own, with a stream within the diploma of diploma in social work. And that was introduced, as it was, I think, for other social workers, because what I've just said about probation applies also to people who work in say mental health rather than childcare. So having created generic social workers, they needed to discover, and did rediscover, that there are some specialist knowledges that need to be acquired as well, and can't just be dealt with generically. In 1994, as we saw, probation was rejected. Probation rejected social work. There was no longer a requirement to hold a social work qualification. And for a few years, there was a gap known affectionately as the Howard Gap. And in 1997, the new qualification, the Diploma in Probation Studies, was introduced and was excellent. And I think in the end, it was probably abandoned only because it was not available to all probation staff. And many probation staff were not probation officers, and they were not getting the benefit and opportunities of those trainings. And more recently, again, we've had first of all, the PQF, the Probation Qualifying Framework, and now we have the Professional Qualification in Probation. Throughout that time, De Montfort and other people who have tried to develop and help probation staff to develop have concentrated on this. We want staff who are competent and reliable, but also those who can find ways of realizing probation's values in their practice. People who can use their judgment, who are self-aware, who can articulate and defend the service's purpose and mission, because we are accountable to the wider community for how probation goes about its work. People who can contribute to policy on the basis of their experiences in practice, and who can achieve a depth of understanding so that they can respond to change, because the world is always changing, and indeed initiate change and try to guide it in a fitting direction. Sometimes often probation has had to contend with populist punitivism, and I understand what I've noticed, and you may have done, that our Prime Minister recently has been rattling the cage again, because it's an old belief that there's votes in being nasty to people who commit crimes. And the beliefs, and sometimes these aren't even made explicit, but they are part of what we all know about crime. It's a repertoire of arguments that are drawn upon in the newspapers and by politicians all the time. Prison makes us safer. The way to make people behave well is by threatening them. Offenders aren't us. They shouldn't have the same opportunities. Some people are evil and can't change. People should be defined as offenders. And probation, I think, resists this. The response to prison making us safer is no, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. We should be skeptical about prison. Prison, for the most part, delays desistance and aggravates the problems that it purports to solve. We are skeptical as a profession about the value of deterrence and coercion. These are poor ways of influencing people, irrespective of their ethical dubiety. We think that social inclusion matters. Of course, people who've committed crimes are us. And of course, we believe in the possibility of change. And Brian Stevenson argues, believe that everyone is more than the worst thing that they have ever done. A very important sentiment, that. How should we express that in practice? Well, here's some suggestions, and I think a lot of this characterizes contemporary probation practice, and I hope it's defended vigorously and will continue to be defended robustly in the times ahead. We should be arguing for non-custodial sentences wherever possible, and that's a lot more often possible than is supposed. We should replace threat and coercion with encouragement and engagement and motivation. Generally, you bring out the best in people by treating them well. We should enable people to have access to the social services, the social capital that they need, not only to avoid offending, but in order to thrive and live lives that are worth living as a matter of social entitlement. And we should not give up on people. rehabilitative work has its place, and it includes a patience and a resolve to keep doors open, however many times people seem to be reluctant to or able to take advantage of the opportunities that we give to them. And then lastly, this question of desistance perspectives. But I think this is my last slide, and I'm about to click it. But the sentiment of Brian Stevenson at the bottom: everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done. And to describe people and approach them as offenders all the time is simply to reduce them, to dishearten them, to mislead them, and to apply an altogether wrong-headed and immoral approach towards crime and punishment. I'm done for now, but I'm hoping to hear some questions and comments. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thanks, Rob. I really enjoyed your presentation. Yes, indeed, we've had comments and questions from our lovely audience. I've got lots of questions as well, but I'm going to put the audience's questions to you first and see how far we get, because I can access you very regularly, and I appreciate our audience might not be able to. So Lee Quinney has asked you, has the research on what probation officers actually do been accepted by government as social work once again?
Thanks for the question, Lee. It's a good question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to it. I think it's really quite fluid, isn't it? I mean, even when I was writing this presentation, we had a Minister of Justice, Robert Buckland, and now we have another Minister of Justice. So the extent to which probation, to which government understands what probation actually does and whether they care about it and whether they think it's the right thing to do, is terribly fluid. I'm excited that we have some good folk now working in Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service who understand probation in a way that was not always apparent in some of their predecessors. The alignment of probation and prison, I think, led to was pretty much a takeover rather than a merger. Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether probation, I think they would still be frightened of that association. Social work bespeaks care. The government does not want probation to be about care. Care is the wrong image to present. And a question that you might want to reflect on is simply to wonder, is there a difference between what probation is and how it is regarded? Is there a distinction there at all?
You've usefully highlighted, though, how probation is caring as well, Rob, and I think you've highlighted that those values are in essence the same as social work values. And one question I had was, what can, if we're thinking about probation as social work, and I think you hinted at this idea that social work is also probation, especially in kind of sort of you talked about the specialist knowledge. So what can social work learn from probation, do you think?
That's a great question. And I think that was always a question that was dodged. When I trained, probation was looked at a little bit askance by social workers because they thought we were the bossy lot, the officious lot, the authoritarian lot. But of course, that I think is they may have felt more relaxed with themselves if they could project all those anxieties onto probation staff. But of course, social work is a profession of law enforcement. Mental health work, the protection of vulnerable people, of children, the public protection is at the heart of what they do. And I don't know how much they have been able to, because I haven't been involved in social work for such a long time. I don't know whether ideas like motivational interviewing, how much that kind of thing has had its effect. But I don't see how you can work with people who may be reluctant to work with you unless you somehow find a way of doing this. So I think probation officers do still care, but occasionally they are encouraged to be not caring. And something I didn't mention, but perhaps I can briefly now, I worry about processes of recall of people who've been released from prison, and about how non-compliance, because of an idea that people are still being punished only now in the community, that the right response to that is recall, which seems to me a bad idea, and will undermine the confidence and mutual trust on which probation ought to depend.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lee also raised a point around this and you helpfully highlighted the kind of risk assessment model that kind of filtered into probation. And Lee sort of poses, I think, the question: risk hides needs. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think Lee has made another excellent point, because I think that's exactly right. We had this idea, didn't we, the RNR, which I think is probably familiar to most people. We should look at risks, we should look at needs, and then we should look at responsivity. Well, responsivity, I think, was under-theorized and underdeveloped anyway. And then along comes somebody, it might have been Andrews or Bonter, and says, well, actually, criminogenic needs are risks in disguise. They're dynamic risks that you can work with. So at this point, it looks almost as if RNR has collapsed into R for risk. But of course, behind those, there are real social needs that ought to be met, not because of their contingent relationship with offending, or not only for that reason, but because the state has a duty to look after needy citizens. That seems to me, anyway, that's a political view of mine. It's an endangered political view in the current climate, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Another question from John Scott. Hello, John. What can we learn from the system in Scotland or Ireland, where social work structures and models have stayed intact over recent years? And you've done international work, haven't you, Rob? When I first started at De Montfort, probably 20 years ago nearly, I remember you going off to certain places talking about, probation and setting that up in the sort of the jurisdictional differences, I suppose, and some are closer to home. How can that be explained?
Well, can I take John's question first? Because I can touch upon this as well. Because I think there's much to learn from that. Because I think Scotland, and I don't know if John was referring to Northern Ireland or to Ireland, because those are differences again. And in fact, John himself knows a great deal more about Ireland than I do. But these are nations that are not frightened of saying that probation is involved in social work. They characterize the work of probation. Well, they don't have probation. They talk about, they have probation in Northern Ireland. They don't, and in Ireland, but not in Scotland. They have criminal justice social workers. That has led to some difficulties for them, I think, because although it continues to hold on to what I believe to be the proper conception of probation-like work or criminal justice social work, I think there have been times when the imperatives and the massive demands on resources from other areas of social work have made it very difficult for Scotland to maintain the resourcing and the specialism that's necessary for criminal justice social work. So again, you have that problem, that tension between genericism and specialism. But certainly, I think there's much to learn from Scotland. And in the old days, when the Council of Europe used to look to the UK and say, let's talk to people in England about probation, I rather disloyally said, no, you're better off talking to people in Scotland.
Thank you. A question from Robin Moore. Rob, he said, hi, Rob. Does the language of risk factors remain problematic if it is recognised that risk and protective factors can exist at the individual, family, community and society levels? Wow.
Great question, Robin, and hello to you. Always a pleasure to meet with you, Robin. I think it still remains problematic, even though it does operate at those different levels, and they do need to be disentangled. But my my main point, I think, was that the language of risk suppresses the social disadvantage that lies behind so much offending, and encourages that reductive conception of offenders as people against whom we need to be protected, who need to be despised, who need to be marginalized, rather than as fellow citizens, although I know that they're also non-nationals, but as people who are us, who belong in our communities, are entitled to all the risks, entitled to all the services and opportunities to avail themselves of the protective factors that exist at those different levels you've differentiated.
Okay, thank you. And we have several comments from Jake Phillips. Hello, Jake. He poses the idea that should we be more critical of social work in itself, and why should probation, I think, lean towards social work values? We'll start with that one, and I will digest the other.
Should I tell him that I'm considering submitting something about this to his journal or not? I don't know whether it's no, I mean, it's a tremendously important question, because the question in the 1980s and 1990s was, is probation social work? Maybe the question now is social work social work? And I don't know enough about modern social work to be able to comment too much on its current practices. But in the sense of that social work definition that I put up on a slide earlier on, I can't see anything there that probation should be wanting to disclaim. It seems to me that probation can own all of those principles. I don't know how social work understands its values nowadays. Maybe social work too is becoming officious and bureaucratic and oppressive, in which case I would be very happy to be more critical of social work. But the alliance and the associations between those professions, the training that they need, the skills that they need, the knowledge and the values that they need, it's that alignment that I particularly wanted to emphasize in my talk.
And Jake makes an interesting point where he says, should we not be thinking about moving probation work beyond the problematic institutions of CJS and social work, rather than reincorporating it into equally problematic institutions?
Yeah. Well, no, again, I completely recognize that. However it's conceptualized, I want probation, and for all I know social work as well, to be understood in this much more rounded way, which used to mark those the professional training. But I think that's right. Perhaps I should say also that I lament the loss of the generic training, in the sense that the placement that taught me most when I was training was in a regional drug addiction unit, which was attached to a psychiatric hospital. Opportunities of that kind are no longer available to probation staff in training. Why not? Well, because probation wants to be in charge, and all the placements got to be there, and probation is different from everything else. But probation will always work with people who are needy in any number of different ways, and to have a perspective from a different institution or organization, even problematic ones, Jake, I think is enriches our understanding of the work.
And so what kinds of inquiry do you think we need to undertake to, perhaps, based on your presentation today, what are the gaps, do you think, in terms of understanding the work of probation much more closely?
I'd like to see even more development of the idea of trauma-informed practice. That becoming increasingly salient, isn't it? This is not an expression and adverse childhood experiences and so forth. This is becoming far more salient than it was at the time. And I think it becomes, the more you recognize that, the harder it becomes to reduce people to the worst things that they've ever done, because you begin to recognize them in the round. So we can go on and say, oh, prisoners, what terrible people prisoners are. And then you read a story, as we have all of us read in today's paper, unless it was yesterday's paper, about some poor woman who was expecting a baby and was completely let down in the course of her sentence with the result of the baby's death. And at that point, you say, well, actually, here we have a mother. We don't have a prisoner, we have a mother. And if you can begin to understand people in that more rounded, more holistic sense. So I think these things should be brought to the surface. And our friend and colleague Gwyneth Boswell, I think, was among the first people to help me to understand that. She did some pioneering work in which she was among, I think, the very first to say, if you talk to people who have committed young people who've committed the gravest of crimes, almost to a person, they have a background of misery and abuse. Now, I'm not saying that that's responsible for, I'm certainly not saying that that's an excuse for the crimes that they've committed. It may not even be as complete an explanation as some people suggest. But I think if we recognize that, it might at least make us more reluctant to continue to heap pain upon them.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've got time for just one last question from Gerard Ploeg. I hope I've said that correctly. How strong do you think has the emergence of assessment tools stimulated the emphasis on risk, the kind of turn to the actuarial?
Well, this is a particular friend of mine, Gerhard. Very good to see you, and thank you for tuning in. Yes, and I think not everyone will know that Gerhard works in Norway now. And Norway, I don't know if they still use it, but they did pioneer a risk assessment system, an assessment system, which was called BRIC, which didn't actually try to focus on risk, as I recall, and I don't know if I've given him a chance to correct me, but it said that we can't quantify risk. So the idea that, you get ogres scores and you get OASIS and all of that stuff. Assessment tools, I think, precisely encourage the focus on risk and the suppression of need, although they would deny that. And OASIS certainly tries to do better than that. It doesn't suppress need. It tries to understand it in a different way. BRIC says, why do you get into trouble? What can we do to help you not get into trouble? Which I think these are generally better questions than exactly what percentage of risk are you, and how can we quantify and reduce your holistic circumstances to those circumstances, to that assessment. Gerhard has kindly put in the comments that I'm correct. So I'm not misleading you too badly. Thank you.
Oh, and apologies for mispronouncing your name.
I think he's used to it, bless him. Yeah.
Oh, bless. I think we're done for time, Rob. Thank you so much on behalf of us all attending today, and for kickstarting and a celebration of probation here at De Montfort and wider. And I really enjoyed your talk, not least the sort of historical overview as well, which I found fascinating, all in my lifetime as well. So thank you so much, everyone. We're going to be continuing these kinds of discussions. We have 2 more probation digital events in October, one in November, and there's going to be more to come. So we'll be circulating that through our normal outlets. So keep an eye on that. Thanks so much, Rob. You are a superstar. The godfather of probation here at De Montfort University.
I'll make you offers you can't refuse.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, everyone.